David had always known his place. The youngest of 8 brothers, the smallest, the one always left behind while the others were given important work. Jesse, his father, was a respected man in Bethlehem, and his older brothers, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, were warriors, men of strength, sons to be proud of. But David? He was just a shepherd, and not even an important one. His job was to watch the sheep, to make sure none wandered off, to chase away the occasional wolf with a sling and a stone. No one looked at him and thought of a leader, a king, or even a warrior. Even his own father barely acknowledged him. But what no one knew, what even David himself didn't fully understand, was that God had already chosen him for something greater, and his life was about to change forever. That morning, David was in the fields, tending to the flock, as he always did. The sun rose slowly over the hills of Bethlehem, its golden light stretching across the landscape. The air was crisp, the scent of the earth rich and familiar. David loved this place, this quiet, endless space, where he was alone with the sheep, alone with his thoughts, alone with God. And so, as he often did, he sang, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." His voice floated over the hills, gentle yet strong. But in the distance, something was happening in his father's house, something David could not yet see. Back in Bethlehem, a man had arrived, not just any man, the prophet Samuel. People whispered in awe as he passed through the streets, his presence bringing both excitement and fear. Jesse, David's father, stood at the entrance of his home, his face tight with uncertainty as Samuel approached. "Jesse of Bethlehem," the prophet greeted, his voice firm, his eyes sharp. "I have come to anoint the one the Lord has chosen." Jesse stiffened. "Anoint? Chosen?" His mind raced. Was Samuel looking for a warrior, a leader, a king? Surely it had to be Eliab, tall, strong, a man built for battle, or perhaps Abinadab or Shammah, both experienced, both capable. Jesse quickly called for his sons, his chest swelling with pride as they lined up before the prophet. Samuel studied them carefully. His eyes moved over Eliab, the eldest, who stood with confidence, broad-shouldered and sure of himself. "This must be him," Jesse whispered. Samuel lifted the oil in his hand, ready to pour it over the chosen one. But then, something happened. The Lord spoke, and Samuel's hand stilled. "Do not look at his appearance or height," the Lord whispered in Samuel's heart, "for I have rejected him. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Samuel frowned, lowering the oil. Jesse's smile faltered. The prophet turned to the second son, Abinadab, then the third, Shammah, then the next, and the next, and the next. Each time Samuel shook his head. "The Lord has not chosen these." Jesse's confidence crumbled. All 7 of his sons stood before Samuel, yet none had been chosen. Samuel exhaled slowly, rubbing his beard. "Are these all your sons?" he asked. Jesse hesitated. Then, almost as an afterthought, he muttered, "There is still the youngest." He didn't say David's name, but he is tending the sheep. Samuel's gaze sharpened. "Send for him." David knew something was wrong the moment he saw the messenger running toward him. No one ever came looking for him. No one ever called him home unless something was broken, lost, or in trouble. As he hurried toward the house, his heart pounded. What could be so important that his father finally remembered him? As he reached the door, he stopped short. His brothers were lined up, standing tall, their expressions unreadable. And in the middle of it all stood a man David had never met before. An old man, his eyes piercing, holding a flask of oil in his hands. "David," Jesse said stiffly, "come forward." David swallowed hard, stepping cautiously into the room. Samuel's eyes locked onto him. And in that moment, David felt something shift. A stillness fell over the room, heavy and certain. Samuel nodded slowly. "This is the one," he murmured. David's brothers stiffened in shock. Jesse's mouth parted, but no words came. David, too stunned to speak, could only stand as Samuel uncorked the oil. The prophet's voice echoed through the house. "The Lord has chosen you, David, son of Jesse, and today you are anointed in his name." David felt the warm oil trickle down his forehead, his skin tingling as if fire and light had touched him at the same time. The moment was brief, but the weight of it settled deep into his soul. He was still just a shepherd. He was still small, unnoticed, the forgotten son. But God had not forgotten him. And though he did not yet know how, his life would never be the same. David stood motionless, the scent of the sacred oil still clinging to his skin, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. Had he heard correctly? Had the prophet of the Lord truly poured oil over his head and called him chosen? The flickering lamps in his father's house cast strange shadows over the faces around him. His brothers, normally full of boasting and confidence, now stood silent, their expressions unreadable. His father, Jesse, was pale, his eyes darting between Samuel and David as if trying to make sense of something that should have been impossible. But it had happened. David had been anointed. Yet, what did that even mean? Samuel stepped back, his gaze still fixed on David as if measuring him in ways no one else could. David swallowed hard, his voice hesitant. "My lord, what does this mean?" His words barely rose above a whisper, but they carried through the still room like a trumpet. Samuel, never one for unnecessary words, simply nodded. "It means that the Lord has seen your heart, David, and he has chosen you for something far greater than tending sheep." David's chest tightened. "Chosen for what?" A flicker of something unreadable passed through Samuel's eyes, something between certainty and sorrow. "The Lord will reveal it in time," he said. "But know this, he is with you. From this day forward, you are set apart." David's throat felt dry. Set apart? The words weighed heavier than the oil soaking into his curls. The Lord was with him? Had the Lord ever been with him before, out in the fields, when he was alone? When no one thought of him? When his brothers left him behind and his father forgot him? Was the Lord with him then? Had he always been? David had no answer, only the weight of Samuel's words pressing into his soul. "This is a mistake." The voice came sharp and full of resentment. David blinked, turning toward his eldest brother Eliab, whose face had darkened with barely contained fury. "This cannot be right." Jesse hesitated, his hands tightening into fists. "Samuel," he said slowly, trying to choose his words carefully, "are you certain? He is the youngest, the smallest, a boy." David flinched, though he wasn't surprised. "Eliab is strong," Jesse continued, motioning toward his eldest son. "He is a warrior." Samuel held up a hand, silencing him. "I do not choose as men choose, Jesse. The Lord looks at the heart." Eliab's jaw clenched. "Then my heart is not enough?" he snapped. David swallowed hard, shifting his weight uncomfortably. He had always known Eliab did not think highly of him, but now, for the first time, David saw something deeper than frustration. Resentment, bitterness, almost as if Eliab couldn't believe this was happening. Samuel turned to Eliab, his expression firm, unwavering. "You were not forgotten. You were passed over." The room seemed to shrink. Eliab's face burned with anger, his hands curling into fists, but he said nothing, and neither did David. Because what could he say? He had never asked to be chosen. He had never wanted to be more than what he was, a shepherd, the keeper of his father's flocks. But now, everything had changed, and he wasn't sure if he wanted it. Samuel left before dawn, his sandals barely making a sound as he disappeared into the morning mist. His task was finished. The boy had been anointed, but what came next would not be easy. David knew nothing had changed in the eyes of his family. He was still the youngest, still just a shepherd. His father had given him no words of approval. His brothers had not embraced him. Even as the oil dried in his hair, life had gone back to normal. Jesse sent David back into the fields that very morning, as if nothing had happened, as if he was still invisible. David climbed the familiar hills, his heart heavy with questions. If I have been chosen, why do I still feel forgotten? The sheep bleated softly, moving in clusters around him. David leaned against a rock, his fingers absent-mindedly picking at the leather strap of his sling. And then, without thinking, he whispered the words that had burned in his chest since the moment the oil touched his skin. "Lord, are you really with me?" The wind stirred through the trees, soft, steady, strong. And in his heart, David felt something stir, something deep, something unchanging. And though no voice answered him, he knew he was not alone. He had never been alone. And the Lord, the great and mighty Lord, was not finished with him yet. The sun hung high over the hills of Bethlehem, casting golden light over the land. David sat on a large, smooth rock, his staff resting beside him as the sheep grazed lazily in the fields below. It had been weeks since Samuel anointed him, and yet nothing in his life had changed. His father still barely acknowledged him. His brothers still dismissed him. And the people of Bethlehem still saw him as nothing more than a shepherd. Yet, something deep inside of him had changed. Before, the fields had been his prison, his reminder that he was the forgotten son, the one who had no place at the table. But now? Now, he knew something that no one else did. The Lord had seen him. And though David did not yet know what that meant, he knew it meant something. One afternoon, as David sat playing his harp, the gentle melody drifting across the pasture, he noticed movement on the horizon. A figure rushed toward him, kicking up dust as he ran. It was one of the servants from his father's house. David sat up straight, setting his harp aside. "David!" the servant called, breathless. "Your father calls for you. You must come at once." David blinked. "Me?" It was rare for Jesse to send for him. Had something happened? Without hesitation, David grabbed his staff and hurried toward home. When he arrived, the house was crowded. His father, Jesse, stood near the entrance, speaking in hushed tones with an unfamiliar man. David's brothers were there too, their expressions unreadable. David approached cautiously, unsure of what was happening. "Father," he said hesitantly. Jesse turned, his gaze as firm and unreadable as ever. "You will be traveling to Gibeah," he said without preamble. David frowned. "Gibeah?" "King Saul has requested you," Jesse said simply. David stared, his mind reeling. Saul? The king? He had never met the king before. Why would Saul request him? The unfamiliar man, a messenger by the looks of him, stepped forward. "Word of your skill with the harp has reached the court," he explained. "King Saul is troubled, and he seeks someone who can play music to ease his spirit." David's mouth felt dry. "I am to play for the king?" Jesse nodded, though his expression lacked warmth. "You will go immediately." David glanced at his brothers, searching their faces for some sign of approval, but he found none. Eliab's jaw was tight, his arms crossed over his chest. Abinadab looked away, his expression unreadable. They were not impressed, they were not proud. And suddenly, David understood. They did not believe he was chosen. Samuel may have anointed him, but his family still saw him as the same boy who watched the sheep. "Why would the king request him?" Eliab muttered. David pretended not to hear, because it didn't matter. For the first time in his life, someone was calling him to something greater. And though he did not know what lay ahead, he would answer the call. The journey to Gibeah was long, the roads winding through valleys and rugged terrain. David traveled alongside Saul's messenger, carrying nothing but his harp and his staff, the only tools he had ever needed. As they neared the city, David's thoughts raced. Saul, the king of Israel, a warrior, a leader, a man chosen by God. Yet, something was wrong. If the king was troubled, if his spirit was restless, did that mean the Lord had turned away from him? David did not know, but he would soon find out. When he arrived at the palace, the weight of the moment settled over him. The grandeur of Gibeah was unlike anything he had ever seen. Tall stone walls, courtyards filled with soldiers, the banners of Israel waving proudly in the wind. He was led into the king's chambers, his heart pounding in his chest, and then he saw him. Saul sat on a great chair, his shoulders broad, his face strong yet weary. But his eyes, they held something David could not quite place. Restlessness, fear, something fractured. The king turned his gaze toward David, studying him. David bowed low. "My lord," he said softly. Saul's jaw tightened, his fingers twitching. "Play," the king muttered. David nodded, carefully settling himself before the harp. He took a slow breath, allowing the familiar feeling of the strings beneath his fingers to calm him. Then he played. The music filled the room, soft and steady, rising and falling like the gentle flow of water. David closed his eyes as he played, his fingers moving with ease, the melody lifting into the air like a prayer. And then he felt it, a shift in the room, a stillness, a peace. He dared to glance at Saul. The king, who had been restless and troubled just moments before, now sat completely still. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing slowed, and for the first time in what seemed like years, Saul knew peace. The torment in his spirit had been quieted. David turned back to his harp, his heart steady. He had been called to the palace to play music. But somehow he knew it was more than that. This was only the beginning, and the Lord was still writing his story. David had spent months in the palace of Saul, but he was still unsure of his place. He was not a noble. He was not a warrior. He was not even an official servant. He was simply there, called upon when Saul's spirit grew dark, when the weight of the kingdom pressed too heavily upon his shoulders. And so David played. Night after night, his harp filled the halls of Gibeah, soft melodies that wove peace into the troubled king's mind. But David knew peace never lasted long for Saul. One evening after David had finished playing, Saul sat in his great chair, his fingers rubbing his temples as if trying to fight off the heaviness that constantly lingered over him. The room was dimly lit, the torches flickering against the stone walls. "Boy," Saul muttered, breaking the silence. David straightened, his hands still resting on his harp. "Yes, my lord." Saul's eyes narrowed, his gaze searching. "Why do you not fear me?" David hesitated. It was an odd question. Had he given the king the impression that he was fearless? Surely he was not. But he did not fear Saul the way others did. He feared the Lord. And something in his heart told him that Saul was a man who had forgotten how to do the same. "You are the Lord's anointed," David said carefully. "Why should I fear you?" Saul let out a bitter chuckle. "Is that what you think?" he muttered. "That I am still the Lord's chosen?" David didn't answer right away, because he wasn't sure. He had heard the whispers. He had seen the fear in the eyes of Saul's servants, the way they spoke of him in hushed voices. They said that the Spirit of the Lord had left him, that he was not the same king he had once been. David had seen it himself, in the way Saul's moods shifted like the wind, in the way his rage flared unpredictably, his peace crumbling as quickly as it had come. David did not know what had happened to the king before he arrived at the palace, but he knew this much. Saul was a man at war with himself, and though he was still Israel's ruler, something in him was broken. Saul exhaled, shaking his head. "You are a strange boy, David." David smiled faintly. "So I've been told." Saul watched him for a long moment before leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Tell me," he said, "do you believe in destiny?" David frowned. "I believe in the Lord." Saul smirked, shaking his head. "You remind me of myself when I was young." David's brows lifted slightly. "Do I?" Saul nodded, though his expression was far from fond. "I too was once chosen," he murmured, more to himself than to David. "Once young and full of promise. The Lord's hand was upon me. The people cheered my name. I was invincible." David listened carefully, sensing something deeper behind the king's words. "And now?" David asked quietly. Saul's jaw tensed. "Now," he said bitterly, "I am left wondering if the Lord still knows my name." The word sent a chill through David's chest, because he had been anointed by the same prophet who had anointed Saul. And yet look at Saul now, a king who had been chosen, a king who had been powerful, and yet a king who now lived in fear of losing everything. David's mind raced with questions. Could he become like this? Could a man truly rise to the throne, anointed by God himself, only to fall from his favor? What had Saul done? And would David one day make the same mistake? He did not know. But one thing was certain. David did not want to be like Saul. And so, that night, as he left the king's chamber and returned to his own quarters, David knelt to pray. "Lord," he whispered, his hands clasped together tightly, "whatever you have planned for me, whatever my future holds, let me never forget you." And though the room was silent, David felt peace settle over him. Because even if no one else saw him, even if his family had forgotten him, even if the king of Israel did not understand him, the Lord saw, and David knew he would never be forgotten. The days passed, and David continued serving in Saul's court, playing his harp when the king's spirit grew troubled. But something was shifting in Israel. Whispers filled the palace corridors, murmurs of a new enemy rising against them, the Philistines. David had heard of their cruelty before, of their warriors, of their iron weapons that gleamed in the sun. But this time, there was something different about the fear in the voices of the men. This time, they were not speaking of an army. They were speaking of a man, a giant, a warrior unlike any other, Goliath of Gath. One evening, as David walked the outer courtyard of the palace, he overheard a group of soldiers speaking in hushed tones. "He stands nearly 10 feet tall," one muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I heard his spear alone is heavier than a man," another said. "And Saul does nothing? What can he do?" The first soldier sighed. The Philistines have challenged us to send one man to fight him. If he wins, we will rule over them. If he loses... The men fell silent, the unspoken fear heavy in the air. David stepped closer, curiosity burning inside him. "What does he say?" he asked. The men turned, startled to see him. "The giant?" one soldier scoffed. "He mocks us. Every morning and every evening he stands in the valley and shouts at our people. He curses Israel, mocks Saul, and challenges anyone brave enough to face him." David felt something tighten in his chest. "And no one has answered him?" The men exchanged uneasy glances. "Who would?" one finally muttered. "No man can stand against him." David frowned. No man? But what about the Lord? That night, as David sat in his quarters, the words of the soldiers echoed in his mind. A giant mocking Israel, a warrior cursing the name of the Lord, and no one would face him. David knew what it felt like to be underestimated, to be the smallest, the forgotten, the one no one believed in. But he had also seen the Lord's faithfulness. He had stood before lions and bears and walked away victorious, not because of his own strength, but because the Lord had been with him. And so as he lay awake staring at the ceiling, a thought crept into his mind. What if the Lord wants someone to answer the giant? What if no one else had answered because they weren't meant to? What if this was meant for him? The thought shook him. But it also settled deep into his bones, and for the first time since Samuel had poured the oil over his head, David felt a stirring in his heart. A call, a purpose, a battle that would change everything. The next morning, as David prepared to leave for Bethlehem, his mind was still racing. His father had summoned him home, but not for battle. Jesse had heard of the Philistine threat, and like any father of sons in the army, he was worried. He had instructed David to take provisions to his brothers, to bring them food and check on them. "Make sure Eliab is well," Jesse had said, "and the others. Let me know how the battle fares." David had nodded. But as he gathered the bread, the roasted grain, the cheeses for the commander, something inside him told him that this journey would be different, that he was not just taking food, that he was not just running an errand, that this was the reason he had been sent to Saul's palace in the first place. This was why he had been anointed, because there was a battle waiting for him. And though he did not yet know how, he knew the Lord was sending him to face it. The sun rose over the hills as David set out on his journey toward the valley of Elah. The wind carried the scent of dust and dry grass, and the faint clang of metal could be heard in the distance. The sound of soldiers sharpening their blades, preparing for a battle they feared they could not win. David walked steadily, carrying the provisions his father had sent him with, bread, roasted grain, and cheese, but his mind was not on the food. His mind was on Goliath. The whispers of the giant had reached every ear in Israel, yet no man had dared to face him. David's heart burned at the thought. How could this be? How could a Philistine warrior stand day after day and mock the Lord's people, and no one rise to silence him? David's grip tightened on the cloth sack slung over his shoulder. He did not yet know how he would fight, if he would fight, or if he was even meant to. But something deep in his spirit told him this journey was leading him to more than just his brothers. As David neared the encampment, the air grew thick with tension. Soldiers were everywhere, some tending to their weapons, others murmuring among themselves. The entire camp seemed weighed down by an unseen burden. Then, a sound broke through the morning stillness, a deep bellowing voice, laced with mockery and arrogance, echoing from the valley below. "Is there no man among you who will fight?" David's breath caught. He followed the sound, stepping carefully between tents and armor-clad men until he reached the ridge overlooking the valley, and then he saw him. Goliath. A towering figure stood in the center of the battlefield, clad in gleaming bronze armor, his spear thick as a weaver's beam. His shield-bearer stood beside him, but the man was hardly needed. No one had dared to attack. The giant laughed, his voice carrying through the valley. "Come, Israelites, choose your champion. Send someone to fight me." David's stomach turned as he glanced at the men around him. Their faces were pale, their bodies stiff with fear. No one moved, not one man lifted his weapon. And then David spotted his brothers. Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah stood among the soldiers, their expressions grim. David rushed to them, his voice quick with urgency. "What is happening?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Why is no one fighting him?" Eliab turned sharply, his face darkening at the sight of David. "What are you doing here?" he snapped. "Why have you left the sheep? Have you come to watch the battle, like a foolish boy with nothing better to do?" David stared at him, taken aback. "Father sent me," he said firmly, "to bring food and to see how you fare." Eliab snorted. "And now that you've seen, go home." But David wasn't finished. His chest burned with something stronger than anger, righteousness, conviction. "Why does no one fight him?" he demanded, his voice rising. "How can you all stand here and let him mock the Lord's people?" Eliab's eyes flashed. "Be silent, David." But David would not be silent. He turned to the others around him. "What will be done for the man who defeats him?" A soldier hesitated before answering. "The king has promised riches, his daughter in marriage, and freedom from taxes for his family." David barely heard him. This was not about riches. It was not about rewards. This was about the Lord. "Who is this Philistine," David said loudly, "that he dares to defy the armies of the living God?" Murmurs spread through the camp. People had heard of David, the boy who played for the king, the shepherd from Bethlehem, and now they whispered of him again. "Does he mean to fight?" "The boy is mad. He is no warrior." But David was already turning, already moving. He did not know what tomorrow held. He did not know what lay beyond this moment. But he knew one thing. He could not let Goliath's words go unanswered. He would go to King Saul. He would make his case. And if the Lord willed it, he would stand against the giant. David took a deep breath, his heart steady. Tomorrow would decide everything. And so, with the sun dipping behind the hills and the voices of the fearful rising behind him, David walked toward his destiny. The story ends here, just before the battle begins, because David's story was not about just one victory. It was about faith, about trusting in the Lord when no one else did. And though the world saw him as a shepherd boy, God had already chosen him as a king.